The candle on the dressing table shook as Margaret Doyle threw the door open without knocking. Alara Winters looked up from the small mirror where she had been trying to smooth her hair with her fingers, and her heart sank the moment she saw what her stepmother carried over one arm. It was a dress, but calling it a dress was almost unkind to the word. The fabric was gray and thin, torn at the hem, with a long stain running down one side like an old bruise that never healed. Margaret held it out with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You wanted to go to the ball," Margaret said, "so you shall go." Alara stood slowly, her hands pressed together to stop them from trembling. "That is a work dress, Margaret. That is what I wear to clean the stove." "It is what you will wear tonight." Margaret dropped it onto the bed as though it were something distasteful to hold for even one more second. "The Duke of Ashford is hosting the finest families in the county. You will attend, since you begged so sweetly for an invitation, but you will attend as what you are." Behind her in the hallway, two shapes appeared, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Priscilla and Ivy, Alara's stepsisters, leaned against the doorframe in gowns of blue silk and pale gold, their hair already pinned with small pearls. Priscilla covered her mouth, but the laugh escaped anyway, sharp and delighted. "You cannot be serious," Ivy said, though her tone made it clear she hoped very much that her mother was. "Quite serious," Margaret answered. "Alara has spent 3 years reminding this family that she is still Edmund's daughter, still entitled to a place among decent people. Tonight she will learn what that place looks like when she has nothing behind her but a ruined name and a ruined house." Alara felt the old, familiar tightness rise in her chest, the one that had lived there since the day her father died, and the letters from his creditors began arriving faster than the letters of condolence. She did not let it show on her face. She had learned, over 3 long years, that showing pain to Margaret only fed something hungry in her. "Why would you send me at all?" Alara asked quietly, "if you mean only to shame me." Margaret's smile widened, and for a moment there was something almost like real amusement in it. "Because I want everyone in this county to see exactly what has become of you. I want the Baroness Whitlow to see it, and Lady Cassandra Grey to see it, and every mother with an eligible son to see it, so that no one ever again asks why my daughters do not invite you to their little parties. Tonight, Alara, you will teach a lesson without saying a single word." Priscilla clapped her hands together softly. "Oh, this will be delicious." "You could simply forbid me to go," Alara said. "It would be kinder." "Kindness," Margaret repeated, as though testing an unfamiliar word, "was never part of our arrangement." She turned, gathering her daughters with a glance, and the 3 of them swept from the room in a rustle of silk, leaving Alara alone with the candle, the mirror, and the gray dress lying across the bed like something already defeated. For a long moment, Alara did not move. She thought of her father, Edmund Winters, and the way he used to sit with her by the fire in this very house when it still belonged to them in more than name, telling her that a person's worth was carried inside them, not stitched onto their sleeves. She had believed him then. She was not certain, standing here now, whether belief alone would be enough to carry her through tonight. She picked up the dress. The fabric was rougher than it looked, and there was a small tear near the shoulder that had clearly never been mended. She pressed it against herself in the mirror and studied the reflection. A young woman with tired eyes, dark hair pulled back plainly, and a dress that announced to the entire world that she had nothing left to lose. Perhaps, she thought, that was true. Perhaps there was a strange kind of freedom in having nothing left that anyone could take. A soft knock came at the door, so different from Margaret's entrance that Alara knew immediately who it was. "Come in, Nora." The young maid slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind her, as though the walls themselves might carry gossip to Margaret's ears. Nora's eyes went straight to the dress on the bed, and her face fell. "They cannot mean for you to wear that," Nora whispered. "They mean exactly that." Nora crossed the room and took Alara's hands. "Then do not go, stay here. I will tell them you were unwell." "They would only send someone to check," Alara said. "And Margaret would enjoy dragging me there herself, half-dressed, if it meant humiliating me further." Nora's jaw tightened. She had been in this house since before Edmund Winters had passed, and she remembered a different Alara, one who had laughed easily and worn her own mother's jewelry to church on Sundays. It pained her to see what 3 years under Margaret's rule had worn away. "Then let me at least fix the hem," Nora said, already reaching for a needle from her apron pocket. "And I have a ribbon, a plain one, but it might tidy the collar a little." Alara allowed herself a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Nora, truly." As Nora worked quickly by candlelight, stitching the worst of the tears with quiet, practiced hands, Alara sat very still and let her mind wander to the manor she would soon be walking toward. She had heard of Ashford Manor her whole life, though she had never once set foot inside its gates. It was said to have gardens that stretched further than the eye could follow, and a ballroom with ceilings painted like the sky at dawn. It was said that the Duke himself, Nathaniel Ashford, was a serious man, careful with his words, generous with his tenants, and utterly uninterested in the games that filled most noble drawing rooms. She wondered briefly, foolishly, what such a man would think if he ever noticed a girl in a ragged dress standing at the edge of his ballroom. Then she pushed the thought away. No one would notice her tonight. That was the entire design of Margaret's cruelty. Not that she would be seen and mocked, though that would happen too, but that afterward she would be forgotten, filed away in the minds of the county's finest families as the poor, ruined Winters girl who had once, absurdly, tried to attend a ball. "There," Nora said at last, tying off the last stitch. "It will not fool anyone into thinking it is silk, but at least it will not fall apart on you." "That is more than I expected," Alara said and meant it. A carriage rattled somewhere outside, and both women froze, listening. It was only the stepsisters' carriage pulling away, taking Priscilla and Ivy and their mother toward Ashford Manor in comfort, leaving Alara, as always, to make her own way. "You are to walk," Nora said, disbelief coloring her voice. "In the dark, alone." Margaret was very clear that no carriage would be spared for me. "It is nearly 3 miles. I have walked further for less reason." Alara stood, smoothing the gray fabric over her waist, and reached for the thin shawl that was the only other garment Margaret had permitted her to bring. "Better I go now, while there is still some light left in the sky." Nora hugged her quickly, fiercely, the way she had not dared to in front of Margaret in a very long time. "Hold your head up in there, whatever happens. Do not let them see you flinch." "I do not intend to," Alara said, and she found to her own quiet surprise that she meant that too. She stepped out through the servant's door at the back of the house, into an evening that was turning slowly from gold to violet, and began walking down the long lane that led away from Winters Hall. Behind her, the windows of her childhood home glowed with candlelight that was no longer hers to sit beside. Ahead of her, somewhere past the dark line of the trees, the road to Ashford Manor waited, and with it, though she could not possibly have known it yet, the first night in 3 years that anyone had looked at her and truly seen who she was. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifted her chin the way her father had taught her, and walked on into the coming dark. The lane narrowed as it left the last of the winter's land behind, and the hedgerows rose on either side like tall, silent witnesses. Alara had walked this path 100 times as a girl, chasing after her father while he inspected the fences, but it felt different now, longer, colder, heavier with everything that had changed since those easy afternoons. She thought about turning back more than once. Not because she believed Margaret would relent, but because some small, tired part of her wondered if it would simply be easier to sit by the kitchen fire tonight and let the ball happen without her, the way it happened every year in a world that had quietly decided she no longer belonged to it. But another part of her, quieter and more stubborn, refused to let her stop walking. That part remembered her father's voice, steady and certain, telling her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving despite it. Above her, the first stars were beginning to appear, faint and scattered, and somewhere in the distance an owl called once and fell silent. Alara wrapped the thin shawl tighter and quickened her pace, watching the dark shape of the trees ahead give way, slowly, to the first glow of torchlight marking the road toward Ashford Manor. Whatever waited for her there, she decided, she would meet it standing straight, with her father's name held quietly and proudly inside her, whether anyone else in that grand hall chose to remember it or not. The road grew busier as Alara walked on, though not with anyone who paid her much attention at first. Carriages rolled past in the near darkness, their lamps swinging, their wheels churning up small clouds of dust that settled on her shoulders and in her hair. She stepped aside each time, into the long grass at the edge of the lane, and watched the glow of the passengers inside, silk gloves, powdered faces, the flash of jewelry catching lamplight before the carriage rattled onward and left her again in the dark. She had gone perhaps a mile when a small farm cart slowed beside her, its driver an older man with a weathered face and a patched coat. "Long way to walk this time of night, miss," he said, not unkindly. "Are you headed toward the manor?" "I am," Alara answered, surprised by the sudden ease of speaking to someone who did not already know her name and everything Margaret had made of it. "Climb up, then. I'm carrying baskets for the kitchens there. Might as well carry you a stretch of the way, too." She hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand up onto the seat beside him. The cart smelled of bread and apples, and for the first time that evening, Alara felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. "You don't look dressed for a ball," the farmer said, glancing sideways at her without judgment, simply as an observation. "I am not going as a guest exactly," Alara said carefully, "more as a lesson someone wishes to teach." The old man made a small, thoughtful sound, as though he understood more than she had said. "Well, lessons have a way of teaching the wrong person sometimes. I've seen it happen more than once." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the cart wheels creaking steadily beneath them, until the trees opened suddenly onto a long view Alara had never seen before in her life. Ashford Manor rose in the distance, its windows blazing gold against the darkening sky, its towers and rooftops outlined by dozens of torches lining the drive. Even from this distance, she could hear faint music drifting on the evening air, strings and laughter woven together. "There she is," the farmer said, something like pride in his voice, as though the manor belonged a little to everyone in the county, not only to the Duke who lived inside it. "Never seen a house so grand in all my years, and I've delivered to it every winter for 20 of them." The cart rolled to a stop at a fork in the road, where the servants' path split away from the main drive. "This is as far as I go tonight," the farmer said. "Kitchens are that way. If you're headed to the front, you'll want to follow the main road round." "Thank you," Alara said, climbing down carefully. "You did not have to stop for me." "Wasn't any trouble." He tipped his hat, studying her a moment longer than before. "Whatever they've sent you here to prove, miss, you walk in like you've got every right to be there. Sometimes that's half the battle already." She watched him drive off toward the kitchen entrance, his lantern swinging gently, and then turned to face the long stretch of road that led to the front of the manor. Her legs ached from the walking, and the night air had turned cold enough to bite through the thin shawl, but she made herself walk forward steadily, following the curve of the drive as carriages continued to pass her, slower now, their occupants beginning to notice the lone figure on foot. She heard the whispers before she reached the gates. "Is that girl walking in this cold? Look at her dress. Surely she cannot mean to attend. Perhaps she is lost." Alara kept her eyes forward, her chin level, though every word landed somewhere soft and old inside her, a place that had absorbed 3 years of similar comments, and had, she told herself, grown thick enough by now not to bleed from them. She was nearly at the gate when a familiar carriage rolled past and slowed, its window sliding down to reveal Priscilla's face, flushed with excitement and something crueler underneath it. "Still walking, sister," Priscilla called, loud enough for several nearby carriages to hear. "How dreadfully far, you must be exhausted." Ivy leaned across to see, and her laugh rang out clear and bright in the cold air. "Do try not to trip on the steps, Alara. It would be such a shame to ruin that lovely dress." From inside, Margaret's voice carried too, lower but no less pointed. "Girls, do not linger. We would not want to be seen keeping company with the help." The carriage rolled on, leaving Alara standing at the edge of the gate with her hands curled into fists at her sides, her cheeks burning despite the cold. For one long, terrible moment, she considered turning around, walking back down the dark road toward Winter's Hall and simply disappearing into the kitchen for the rest of the night, letting Margaret win without a witness to make the victory sweet. But then she thought of Nora's fierce embrace, and the careful stitching that had held the worst tears in her dress together, and the farmer's plain, steady words about walking in as though she had every right to be there. She thought of her father, who had built the foundation of this county's respect for the Winters name with nothing but honesty and hard work, and who would not, she was certain, have wanted his daughter to vanish quietly because someone else had decided she was unwelcome. She squared her shoulders, smoothed the front of her ragged dress with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between the gate and this thought, and walked forward into the light spilling from the manor's tall windows. The drive was lined on either side with footmen in crisp uniforms, helping guests down from their carriages, and as Alara approached on foot, several of them turned to stare openly. One young footman stepped forward, uncertain, clearly unsure whether to stop her or assist her. "Miss," he said carefully, "are you attending this evening?" "I am," Alara said, keeping her voice as steady and clear as she could make it. "I was told there would be no difficulty." He glanced past her, toward the darkness where a carriage should have been, and understanding flickered briefly across his young face, understanding, and something like pity quickly hidden. "Of course, miss. This way, if you please." He led her up the wide stone steps toward the entrance, where golden light spilled out through open doors, and the music, faint on the road, now swelled into something rich and full, violins weaving over the low hum of hundreds of voices. Alara's heart pounded as they approached, though she kept her face as calm and composed as she could manage. At the top of the steps stood another servant, older, with a list of names in his hand, tasked with announcing each guest as they entered the grand hall. He looked up as Alara approached, and his brow furrowed with obvious confusion at the state of her dress, so at odds with the shimmering gowns passing through the doors around her. "Your name, miss?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked once quickly over the torn hem and stained fabric. "Alara Winters," she said, and something in the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. The servant paused, consulting his list, and for a moment Alara wondered if her name would not even be found there, if Margaret had somehow arranged for her to be turned away entirely after all this. But then his finger stopped on a line, and he nodded slowly. "Miss Alara Winters," he repeated, and though his voice did not carry the warm formality he had used for the gowned women ahead of her, it did not waver either. He straightened, cleared his throat, and announced her name into the great hall beyond the doors, exactly as he would have announced any other guest. The music did not stop. The world did not end. But as Alara stepped through the doorway into the blazing light and color of the ballroom, she felt every eye nearby turn toward her at once, and she understood with a small, cold drop in her stomach that the hardest part of the evening was only just beginning. Just before the doors, a young woman in deep emerald silk had paused to fix a loose pin in her hair, and she glanced over as Alara passed, her eyes moving briefly over the ragged dress. Alara braced herself for another cutting remark, but instead the young woman offered a small, genuine smile. "You have more courage walking through that door tonight than half the guests inside it," she said quietly, so only Alara could hear. "I hope someone in there has the sense to notice it." Alara blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "That is a very generous thing to say to a stranger." "I am Lady Cassandra Gray," the young woman said, extending a gloved hand, "and I have watched enough cruelty dressed up in fine clothing to recognize real strength when I see it, even in gray wool." She squeezed Alara's hand briefly before releasing it. "Hold your ground in there, whatever happens." She swept ahead through the doors before Alara could respond, disappearing into the golden light and noise of the ballroom, leaving Alara standing a moment longer on the threshold, turning the stranger's words over in her mind like something warm to hold onto. Further down the steps, she noticed Margaret glancing back once briefly, her expression flickering with something like surprise at seeing her stepdaughter still standing, still composed, not yet reduced to tears or retreat. The surprise vanished quickly, replaced by the same cold satisfaction Alara had seen 100 times before. But for one small moment, Alara had seen it waver, and she held onto that moment as tightly as she had held onto Lady Cassandra's kind words. The older servant with the guest list gave a small nod toward the doorway, indicating it was time. Alara took one last breath of the cool night air, felt the thin shawl slip slightly from one shoulder, and did not bother adjusting it. There was no version of tonight in which her appearance would satisfy the room waiting beyond those doors, and she had decided somewhere on the long walk here that she would rather be seen exactly as she was than spend one more moment of her life trying to shrink herself small enough to be forgiven for existing. She lifted her chin and stepped forward into the light. The ballroom of Ashford Manor was larger than anything Alara had ever imagined, its ceiling painted with soft clouds and golden light, as though someone had captured a perfect sunrise and stretched it wide overhead. Hundreds of candles burned in silver holders along the walls, their light multiplied 100 times over by tall mirrors that seemed to hold the entire glittering scene inside themselves. Musicians played from a raised platform near the far wall, and couples turned slowly across the polished floor in gowns of every color Alara could imagine. For one breath she forgot to be afraid. The beauty of the room was so complete, so overwhelming, that it swallowed her fear whole, if only for a moment. Then the moment passed, and she became aware all at once of the eyes turning toward her. It began near the doorway and spread outward like ripples across still water. A woman in violet silk paused mid-sentence, her fan freezing halfway to her face. A cluster of young men near the refreshment table turned to look, then leaned together to murmur. The music did not stop, but conversations around the edges of the dance floor faltered and dimmed as more and more guests noticed the young woman standing at the entrance in a gray, torn dress, so entirely out of place among the silk and jewels that many assumed, for one confused instant, that she must be lost, or that some servant had wandered in by mistake. Alara kept walking. She did not know exactly where she was walking to, only that stopping in the doorway, frozen under the weight of every stare, was not something she intended to allow herself. She moved along the edge of the room, past groups that fell silent as she passed and resumed whispering the moment she had gone by, and found a quiet space near one of the tall windows where she could stand without blocking anyone's view of the dancing. She heard her stepsister's laughter somewhere across the room, bright and cutting, though she could not make out the words over the music. She did not need to. She could imagine well enough what was being said. It was there, standing alone by the window with her back straight and her chin level despite everything inside her wanting to fold small and disappear, that she first became aware of a different kind of stillness settling over one particular corner of the room. Near the head of the hall, at a long table set slightly apart and raised on a low platform, sat the Duke of Ashford himself. Alara had never seen him before, though she had heard him described countless times. A serious man, people said, careful with his words, generous with his tenants, uninterested in the games and gossip that filled most noble gatherings. She had pictured someone older, perhaps, someone worn down by responsibility. The man she saw now was younger than she had expected, dark-haired, with a steady, watchful expression that made it seem as though very little in the room escaped his notice. He had, in fact, noticed her the moment she entered. Nathaniel Ashford had been half listening to a conversation with his uncle, Lord Grantham, about grain prices and the upcoming harvest, nodding at appropriate intervals without truly hearing most of it, when a shift in the room's energy drew his attention toward the doors. He watched the young woman in the gray dress walk the length of the ballroom with a composure that struck him immediately as strange, given the whispers already gathering around her like smoke. Most people, faced with that many judging eyes, either fled or shrank. She did neither. She walked as though the dress on her back was simply a fact of her evening, not a wound to be nursed in front of an audience. "Who is that?" he asked quietly, cutting across whatever Lord Grantham had been saying about wheat yields. His uncle followed his gaze and made a small, disapproving sound. "I believe that is one of the Winter's girls, the elder one. Rather an unfortunate turn of events for that family. From what I understand, the mother remarried poorly, and the estate has suffered greatly since Edmund Winters passed. Nathaniel's attention sharpened at the name. Edmund Winters, he repeated slowly, memory stirring somewhere beneath the surface of the present moment. You remember him then, Lord Grantham said. Good man in his time. Fair with his tenants, always paid his debts before his own comforts if I recall correctly. Died some years back, left the estate to his second wife and her children, more fool him. Nathaniel said nothing more, but his eyes did not leave the young woman by the window. He was remembering now slowly, a night many years ago, long before he had inherited his title, when a much younger version of himself, thrown from a startled horse on a stretch of road he did not know well, had lain injured in a ditch as evening fell and no help seemed to be coming. He remembered the sound of wheels slowing, and a man's voice, calm and unhurried, asking if he needed assistance. He remembered being carried, half-conscious, into a modest but well-kept farmhouse, and waking hours later to find a girl, perhaps 12 or 13 at the time, sitting quietly nearby with a cup of water and a worried expression far too serious for someone so young. He had never learned the family's full name that night, only that the man who had found him along the road called himself Edmund, and had refused any payment for his trouble beyond a promise that Nathaniel would do the same for some other stranger someday, if the chance ever came. Nathaniel had kept that promise more than once in the years since, quietly, without ceremony, exactly as it had been asked of him. He had never expected to encounter the daughter of the man who had first asked it of him, standing now at the edge of his own ballroom, dressed as though the world had decided to punish her for something she had not done. "Are you quite well?" Lord Grantham asked, noticing his nephew's stillness. "Perfectly," Nathaniel said, though his mind was already several steps ahead of his uncle's question, weighing something that felt, in that moment, far more important than grain prices or the polite conversations expected of a duke at his own ball. Across the room, Elara remained near the window, unaware that she had been recognized, unaware of the memory unfolding in the mind of the man watching her from the raised table. She was aware only of the whispers continuing to circle her like restless birds, of Margaret's satisfied glances from across the floor, and of a growing, familiar ache that told her the evening's true purpose, her public humiliation, was very much still underway, regardless of how steadily she managed to stand through it. She did not see Nathaniel rise from his seat until the movement itself seemed to still the room, one small ripple at a time, exactly as her own entrance had done only minutes before. He stood, straightened his coat with a single unhurried motion, and stepped down from the raised platform without a word to his uncle or any of the guests seated nearby, who watched him go with open confusion. A duke did not simply leave his own head table in the middle of his own ball, not without reason, not without some clear and obvious purpose driving him. He crossed the floor directly, cutting a path through startled dancers who hurried to step aside, his eyes fixed the entire time on the young woman standing alone by the window, still unaware that the room's attention had shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, entirely away from her ragged dress, and onto the man walking steadily toward her. Elara noticed the change only when the whispers around her seemed to catch and hold, as though everyone nearby had suddenly forgotten how to breathe at the same moment. She turned, following the direction of a dozen astonished glances, and found herself looking directly into the calm, focused gaze of the Duke of Ashford, who had stopped only a few steps away from her, close enough now that she could see the faint, unreadable expression on his face clearly for the first time. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to those nearest them, though not so loud as to seem staged. "I did not expect to see you here tonight. It is a very great pleasure." The words landed across the room like a struck bell, and Elara felt every fragment of whispered judgment around her falter, then fracture, then begin, slowly, to reassemble itself into something else entirely. For a moment, Elara could not find any words at all. She had braced herself for every possible cruelty the evening might offer, had steeled herself against laughter and pointed stares, and the particular sting of being looked through as though she did not exist. But she had not prepared herself for this, for a duke crossing his own crowded ballroom to greet her by name, as though her presence there were not only acceptable but genuinely welcome. "Your Grace," she managed finally, dropping into the small curtsy that etiquette demanded, though she felt suddenly, painfully aware of how the ragged hem of her dress pooled around her feet as she did. "I confess I did not expect to be recognized." "Did you not?" Nathaniel asked, and there was something gentle in the question, something that suggested he understood far more of her situation than she had told him. "I remember your father very well, Miss Winters. It has been many years, but some kindnesses are not easily forgotten." Around them, the whispering had not stopped, but its character had shifted entirely. Where moments before the murmurs had carried mockery and confusion, now they carried something closer to astonishment, guests leaning toward one another to ask, in increasingly hushed tones, why the Duke of Ashford had crossed his entire ballroom to speak so warmly to a girl in a torn dress. Near the refreshment table, Margaret Doyle had gone very still, her wine glass halfway to her lips, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning alarm. Beside her, Priscilla's mocking smile had frozen and begun, slowly, to crumble at the edges. "You knew my father?" Alara asked, genuinely startled, searching Nathaniel's face for some clue as to how their families could possibly have crossed paths before tonight. "I owe him a great deal more than a passing acquaintance," Nathaniel said. He glanced briefly at the gathered onlookers, and something in his expression suggested he was aware of exactly how many ears were straining to catch every word. Perhaps it would be easier to speak of it somewhere with a little less audience. "Would you do me the honor of a dance, Miss Winters?" The question rippled outward through the nearest clusters of guests like a stone dropped into still water. A dance with the Duke was not a small thing under any circumstances. Offered here, tonight, to a girl in a servant's dress. It was nothing short of extraordinary, and Alara understood, even as she opened her mouth to answer, that whatever happened next would be remembered and repeated across the county for a very long time. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, and if her voice trembled slightly, it was not from fear anymore. He offered his arm, and she took it, aware of the strange, dreamlike quality the moment had taken on, as though she had stepped sideways out of her own life into someone else's story entirely. The musicians, catching some silent signal from the floor manager, shifted smoothly into a slow, graceful waltz, and Nathaniel led her out onto the polished floor as the other dancers parted respectfully to give them room. "You dance very well for someone who claims not to have expected this evening to go this way," Nathaniel observed, a faint warmth creeping into his otherwise composed voice. "My father insisted I learn," Alara said, finding, to her own surprise, that speaking of him here in this unlikely setting brought less pain than it usually did. "He said a person should never let their circumstances decide what they are capable of." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said softly. "I miss him every day." Nathaniel guided her through a slow turn, giving her a moment before he spoke again. "I owe him my life, in fact, though it has taken me a very long time and an unexpected evening to find a way to repay that debt properly. Nearly 10 years ago, I was thrown from my horse on a stretch of road not far from your family's land. It was growing dark, I was injured, and I had very little hope that anyone would pass that way before morning. Your father found me. He carried me to your home, tended to me himself, and refused any payment beyond a promise that I would extend the same kindness to someone else, someday, without expecting anything in return." Alara's steps faltered slightly, though Nathaniel's steady hand kept her moving smoothly through the turn. "I remember that night," she whispered, memory rushing back suddenly, vividly, of a pale, frightened young man laid carefully on the settee in their front parlor, and her father's calm, capable hands cleaning a wound above his temple while she fetched water and tried not to be underfoot. "I did not know who you were. I was only a child." "I did not know either at the time," Nathaniel admitted. "It was some years before I inherited my title, and your father never asked my name, nor offered his own beyond Edmund. I only learned who he was afterward, through a passing conversation with a neighbor, and by then circumstances had carried me elsewhere. I always intended to return and properly thank him. I regret deeply that I did not manage it before he passed." The music swelled gently around them as they turned once more, and Alara found herself studying his face with new understanding, seeing not simply a duke performing an act of public generosity, but a man genuinely moved by a debt he had carried quietly for nearly a decade. "He would have been glad to know his kindness was remembered," she said, "even if he never learned exactly how far it had traveled." "Then let me begin repaying it tonight," Nathaniel said, "in whatever way I am able." Around the edges of the dance floor, the whispers had transformed entirely now, no longer mocking but eager, curious, hungry for every detail of the unfolding story. Lady Cassandra Gray, watching from near the windows with a small, satisfied smile, caught Alara's eye briefly across the room and gave the faintest nod of approval. Elsewhere, several of the county's most influential mothers had already begun recalculating, quietly and rapidly, exactly how they ought to regard the elder Winters girl going forward. Only Margaret Doyle remained frozen near the refreshment table, her carefully constructed evening unraveling in front of the very audience she had assembled to witness Alara's disgrace, watching instead as her stepdaughter moved gracefully across the floor on the arm of the most powerful man in the county, dressed, still, in the ragged gray gown Margaret herself had chosen as a weapon. The weapon, it seemed, had turned entirely in Alara's favor, and Margaret's tightening grip on her wine glass suggested she understood exactly how badly her plan had gone astray. When the dance ended, Nathaniel escorted Alara from the floor with the same easy courtesy he might have shown any honored guest, and the small crowd that had gathered near the edges of the dancing broke into scattered applause, more out of astonishment than tradition. Alara felt the warmth of it settle strangely over her, unfamiliar after 3 years of being overlooked in rooms exactly like this one. She did not have long to enjoy it. Margaret arrived at her side within moments, her expression composed into something resembling pleasant surprise, though the tightness around her eyes told a different story entirely to anyone who knew her well enough to look for it. "Alara, darling," she said, her voice pitched sweetly for the benefit of the nearby guests, "what an unexpected honor for our family this evening." "Yes," Alara said carefully, unwilling to let Margaret's sudden warmth go unnoticed for what it was. "Unexpected indeed." Nathaniel's gaze moved between the two women with quiet, careful attention, missing nothing. "Lady Doyle, I believe," he said, inclining his head politely, though something cooler had entered his tone. "I understand Miss Winters walked here alone this evening." "Quite a distance on a cold night." Margaret's smile flickered, just slightly. "A regrettable misunderstanding with the carriage schedule, Your Grace. I do apologize that Alara was inconvenienced." "And the dress?" Nathaniel asked, his voice mild, though the question landed with unmistakable weight. "Also a misunderstanding." A ripple of interested silence spread through the small circle of guests near enough to hear, several of whom exchanged quick, meaningful glances. Margaret's composure held barely, though a faint flush crept up her throat. "Alara has always been rather independent about her wardrobe, Your Grace," she said. "I confess I do not always succeed in guiding her choices as closely as I might like." It was, Alara understood immediately, a clever lie, one designed to shift blame quietly onto her rather than onto Margaret's own deliberate cruelty, and delivered smoothly enough that it might well have gone unquestioned by anyone who did not already know the truth. "That is not what happened," Alara said quietly, surprising herself with how steady her own voice remained. "Margaret chose this dress for me herself this afternoon and refused to send a carriage." The silence around them deepened, no longer merely interested but charged with something sharper. Margaret's eyes flashed toward her stepdaughter, a warning flickering briefly across her face before she smoothed it away. But the damage, Alara sensed, was already done. Too many guests had heard the exchange clearly, and too many of them, she suspected, had already privately guessed at the truth long before she confirmed it aloud. "Alara, this is neither the time nor the place," Margaret said, a thin edge creeping into her sweetened tone. You created this time and place, Margaret, Alara replied, her voice quiet but no longer trembling. I am only telling the truth of it. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, watching the exchange with the same careful, unreadable attention he had shown throughout the evening, though something had settled more firmly in his expression now, something closer to quiet resolve. Lady Doyle, he said finally, I find myself troubled by what I am hearing. Miss Winters is the daughter of a man I owe a debt I have carried for nearly 10 years. It concerns me greatly to learn she has been treated so poorly under your care. Margaret's composure cracked visibly for the first time that evening. Your Grace, I assure you, there has been some exaggeration. I do not believe there has, Nathaniel said, his tone still even, still measured, but leaving no room for argument. I intend to look further into the matter of the Winters estate, and into the terms under which it has been managed since Edmund Winters's passing. I trust you will have no objection to that. The color drained slowly from Margaret's face. Around them, the gathered guests had gone almost entirely silent now, watching the unfolding scene with the particular hunger reserved for genuine scandal unfolding in real time, rather than the manufactured kind, so many of them had come expecting to witness at Alara's expense. Lady Cassandra Gray had drifted closer during the exchange, and now she stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding a room. I, for one, would be very interested to hear more of the Winters estate's management, she said lightly, though her eyes were sharp as she studied Margaret. I have heard rather troubling rumors myself, about certain debts and certain decisions made rather too conveniently for some parties and not others. A murmur of agreement rippled through several nearby guests, and Alara realized, with a slow, dawning astonishment, that she was no longer standing alone against Margaret's version of events. The room that had gathered tonight to witness her humiliation had, in the space of a single dance and a handful of honest words, begun to turn decisively against the very woman who had orchestrated it. Priscilla and Ivy had gone quiet near the edge of the circle, their earlier delight replaced by something closer to alarm as they watched their mother's careful social standing begin to fray in front of the county's most influential families. This is hardly a suitable conversation for a ballroom, Margaret said tightly, casting about for some way to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond her grasp. Then perhaps we should continue it somewhere more private, Nathaniel said. I will send word to your household within the week, Lady Doyle, requesting a full account of the estate's finances since Edmund Winters's death. Until then, I would ask that Miss Winters remain here at Ashford Manor as my guest, rather than return tonight to a household that has treated her so poorly. The offer landed like a second stone dropped into the same still water, sending fresh ripples of astonishment through the crowd. Alara turned to him, startled, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected and generous offer delivered so publicly, so decisively, in front of an audience that would carry word of it across the entire county by morning. Margaret opened her mouth as though to object, then closed it again, visibly recognizing that any further argument here, in front of so many witnesses already inclined to doubt her, would only deepen the damage already done. She gave a stiff, shallow curtsy instead, murmured something indistinct about needing to see to her daughters, and withdrew quickly toward the far side of the ballroom, Priscilla and Ivy trailing uncertainly behind her. Alara watched them go, feeling the strange mixture of vindication and disbelief settle slowly over her, still barely able to comprehend how completely the evening had turned since she had first walked, humiliated and alone, through the manor's grand doors. "Are you quite well, Miss Winters?" Nathaniel asked quietly, once the immediate circle of onlookers had begun, respectfully, to disperse and return to their own conversations. "I am not entirely certain," Alara admitted honestly. "This has been rather more than I expected from this evening." "For me as well," Nathaniel said, and there was a faint, unguarded warmth in his expression now that had not been there earlier, something that suggested the evening had surprised him too, in ways he had not anticipated when he first rose from his seat at the sight of her. but I do not regret a moment of it. Alara remained at Ashford Manor that night, given a quiet guest room by a housekeeper named Mrs. Bell, who fussed over her with a warmth that reminded Alara achingly of her own mother, gone now for many years. Sleep came slowly, her mind turning over the events of the evening again and again, but when it finally arrived, it was deeper and more peaceful than any rest she had known in a very long time. She did not know, as she slept, that Margaret Doyle was awake through most of that same night, pacing the halls of Winters Hall with mounting desperation, aware that whatever careful arrangement she had built over the past 3 years now stood at serious risk of unraveling entirely. The truth, which Margaret had guarded jealously since Edmund Winters's death, was this: the estate had never actually fallen into the ruin she claimed. Edmund had left behind a modest but stable fortune, tied up carefully in trusts meant to protect Alara's inheritance until she came of age or married. Margaret, as her legal guardian during that period, had spent years quietly redirecting portions of that fortune toward her own comforts and her daughter's extravagant wardrobes, all while presenting a carefully maintained fiction of financial hardship to explain why Alara herself lived in reduced circumstances within her own father's house. It was a fiction that had held, unquestioned, for 3 years. It would not survive the scrutiny of a duke with both the authority and the personal motivation to look closely into it. By the following morning, word had already begun spreading through the county, carried by guests eager to share every detail of the previous night's astonishing scene. Lady Cassandra Grey, true to her word, had begun quietly making inquiries of her own among acquaintances familiar with the Winters estate's legal affairs, and what she uncovered within only a few days confirmed exactly the suspicions she had voiced aloud in the ballroom. Nathaniel received her findings with grim, focused attention, cross-referencing them against records his own steward had begun gathering at his request. The picture that emerged was damning and precise: falsified accounts, inflated claims of debt, and a pattern of withdrawals from Alara's trust that corresponded suspiciously well with the timing of Priscilla and Ivy's new gowns, jewelry, and social engagements over the past 3 years. He called Alara to his study on the 4th day of her stay, laying the evidence before her carefully, watching her face as she absorbed each piece of it in turn. "This cannot be right," Alara said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, pieces of the past 3 years were rearranging themselves in her mind into a new and troubling shape. "Margaret told me repeatedly that father's debts had consumed nearly everything. That was why I could not attend school as Priscilla and Ivy did, why my dresses were always the plainest in the house, why—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, as the full weight of the deception settled over her. "Your father left you considerably more than that," Nathaniel said gently. "Enough, properly managed, to have secured your comfort and education without difficulty. Lady Doyle has spent 3 years lying to you, Miss Winters, not out of necessity, but out of greed." Alara sat very still for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her, grief and anger tangled together with a strange, disorienting relief. She had spent 3 years believing herself a burden, a poor relation tolerated only reluctantly within her own childhood home. Learning now that the poverty itself had been manufactured, deliberately, by the very woman who claimed to be protecting the family's remaining resources, reshaped every memory of those years into something far more painful and far more clarifying than she had expected. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "That depends a great deal on what you wish to happen," Nathaniel said. "The evidence is strong enough to bring formal charges if you choose to pursue them. Misappropriation of a trust is a serious matter, particularly when the beneficiary was a minor at the time much of it occurred. Alternatively, you may simply choose to reclaim control of your inheritance and require Lady Doyle to account fully for what remains, without pursuing the matter through the courts." Alara considered this carefully, weighing the satisfaction of formal justice against the quieter, more practical relief of simply reclaiming what had always belonged to her. "I do not wish to ruin her entirely," she said slowly. "Whatever she has done, Priscilla and Ivy are innocent of it, and I would not see them suffer for their mother's choices. but I will not allow this to continue either. I want my father's estate restored to proper order, and I want the truth known clearly enough that no one mistakes what happened for anything other than what it was." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like admiration settling into his expression. "That is a more generous decision than many would make in your position." "My father taught me that generosity and justice are not opposites," Alara said. "I would like to honor that if I can." Within the week, formal notice was delivered to Winters Hall, requiring Margaret Doyle to appear before the county magistrate alongside representatives of the Ashford estate to account fully for her management of Alara's inheritance. The news spread quickly, and Margaret's carefully cultivated social standing, already badly damaged by the ballroom scene, collapsed almost entirely under the weight of confirmed scandal. Priscilla and Ivy, for their part, arrived unannounced at Ashford Manor 2 days after the notice was delivered, asking to speak with Alara directly. Alara received them cautiously in the manor's smaller sitting room, uncertain what to expect after years of casual cruelty from both of them. "We did not know," Ivy said first, twisting her gloves nervously in her hands. "About the money. Mother told us the estate had truly fallen into difficulty. We believed we were simply fortunate to still have what we did." "I do not know whether to believe you," Alara said honestly, though not unkindly. "I would not blame you," Priscilla said quietly, uncharacteristically subdued. "We were cruel to you, Alara, believing ourselves justified because Mother told us you resented our good fortune. I see now that we were simply cruel, without any justification at all." Alara studied her stepsisters carefully, searching for the mockery she had grown so accustomed to over the past 3 years, and found, to her genuine surprise, only uncertainty and something that looked very much like real regret. "I do not expect us to become close after everything," Alara said finally. "But I do not wish to see either of you punished for choices your mother made. Whatever happens to her, I will ensure you are not left without support." Ivy's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "That is far more generosity than we have shown you." "Perhaps it is time someone in this family broke that pattern," Alara said quietly. The hearing before the county magistrate took place on a gray morning nearly 3 weeks after the ball, in a modest chamber far less grand than the ballroom, where the entire matter had first come to light. Alara attended alongside Nathaniel's steward, who presented the accumulated evidence with careful, methodical precision, while Margaret sat rigid and pale on the opposite side of the room, her lawyer struggling to construct any defense substantial enough to counter the detailed financial records laid before the magistrate. Alara had expected to feel triumphant, watching Margaret's carefully built fiction finally collapse under undeniable proof. Instead, she felt mostly tired and a little sad, as though some small, stubborn part of her had hoped, even now, that there might be an innocent explanation waiting to be found. There was none. The magistrate reviewed the evidence carefully, questioned Margaret directly about several of the more troubling withdrawals, and found her answers evasive and unconvincing. By the end of the morning, he had ruled clearly. Margaret Doyle was to be removed immediately as guardian of Alara's remaining trust, required to repay a significant portion of the misappropriated funds from her own remaining assets, and formally reprimanded for her conduct, though Alara's earlier request for leniency spared her from the more severe criminal charges that might otherwise have applied. Margaret left the chamber without meeting Alara's eyes, her posture stiff with a mixture of humiliation and barely suppressed anger. It was, Alara understood, likely the last time she would see her stepmother for a very long while, and the realization brought less satisfaction than she might have expected, and more simply a quiet, complicated relief that the long deception had finally ended. News of the ruling spread through the county even faster than word of the ball itself had traveled, and in the weeks that followed, Alara found herself the subject of considerably more sympathy than scorn, a reversal so complete it left her faintly dizzy each time she encountered it. Families who had barely acknowledged her existence during the years of her supposed poverty now sent invitations to tea, to garden parties, to small gatherings where, months earlier, she would never have been welcome. She accepted some of these invitations, cautiously, aware that much of the sudden warmth had less to do with genuine affection, and more to do with her restored inheritance and her increasingly visible connection to the Duke of Ashford. She found herself, more often than not, preferring the quieter company of people who had shown her kindness before any of this had happened. Nora, who had come to work permanently in the Ashford household at Alara's request, and Lady Cassandra Gray, whose friendship had begun with a single kind sentence spoken at a doorway and had only deepened since. Priscilla and Ivy, true to Alara's word, were not left destitute by their mother's downfall. Alara arranged a modest but sufficient settlement for each of them, enough to secure their independence without rewarding the years of cruelty that had preceded it. Ivy wrote to her occasionally in the months that followed, careful, tentative letters that spoke of a small cottage she had taken near the coast, and a quiet life she seemed slowly to be building for herself away from her mother's influence. Priscilla's letters came less often, and carried a more guarded tone, but even she in time sent word thanking Alara for a generosity she admitted she had not earned. Margaret herself withdrew from society almost entirely, taking up residence in a small house on the far edge of the county, her once formidable social standing reduced to little more than a cautionary tale whispered occasionally at other families' dinner tables. Alara heard news of her only rarely, second-hand, through acquaintances who mentioned her in passing, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no particular satisfaction in her stepmother's diminished circumstances, only a settled, distant sense that some necessary balance had finally been restored. Through all of it, Nathaniel remained a steady, thoughtful presence, careful never to press Alara toward any decision before she was ready to make it, though it became increasingly clear, in the small gestures and quiet conversations that filled the weeks following the hearing, that his interest in her extended well beyond the debt he had once owed her father. "You did not have to involve yourself so deeply in all of this," Alara said to him one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens behind Ashford Manor, the same gardens she had once heard described only in rumor and had never expected to see for herself. "The debt to my father was repaid the moment you offered me shelter that first night. Everything since has been well beyond what was owed." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said, "though I confess my reasons stopped being solely about debt rather quickly." Alara glanced at him, something warm and uncertain stirring in her chest. What reasons remained then? He considered the question carefully, as he considered most things before answering. "I have met a great many people since inheriting this title, Miss Winters, and very few of them have shown me the kind of quiet, unshakable dignity you carried into my ballroom that night, dressed in rags, surrounded by people determined to see you shamed. I find I am considerably more interested in that dignity than in any debt I might once have owed your father." Alara felt her cheeks warm, though she did not look away from him. "That is a very generous thing to say, Your Grace." "It is simply the truth," he said, "though I would be glad in time if you found it in yourself to call me Nathaniel, rather than continuing with such formal titles between us." "Nathaniel, then," Alara said softly, testing the name, finding it fit more comfortably than she had expected. They walked on together through the gardens in comfortable silence, the autumn light falling gently through the trees, and Alara found herself thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever came next in her life, she intended to meet it the same way she had met that first terrible evening, standing straight, chin level, unwilling any longer to shrink herself smaller than the truth of who she actually was. Winter settled over the county slowly that year, dusting the fields around Ashford Manor with early frost, and it was on one of the first truly cold mornings of the season that Nathaniel asked Alara to walk with him once more through the gardens, this time bundled against the chill, in a warm wool coat that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the ragged dress that had first brought them together. She had spent the past several months settling gradually into her restored inheritance, working alongside Nathaniel's steward to bring the Winters' estate back into proper order, and dividing her time between her father's old house, now carefully repaired and reopened under her own management, and increasingly frequent visits to Ashford Manor, where Mrs. Bell had taken to greeting her with the same warm familiarity she extended to family rather than guests. "You seem thoughtful this morning," Nathaniel observed, as they walked slowly along a path lined with bare, frost-silvered hedges. "I was thinking of my father," Alara admitted. "How strange it is that a kindness he offered a stranger on a dark road so many years ago should eventually lead to all of this. He never knew, of course, what that single choice would set into motion." "I think he would be glad to know it," Nathaniel said. "Not simply for what it has brought you, but for what it revealed about the daughter he raised. I do not believe courage like yours grows without careful tending, Alara. Whatever else Edmund Winters left behind, I think that was his most lasting gift to you." Alara felt the familiar ache of missing her father soften, just slightly, into something gentler, something closer to gratitude than grief. "Thank you for saying that." They walked in silence for a while longer, until Nathaniel stopped beside a small stone bench overlooking the frost-covered garden, the manor rising grand and steady behind them in the pale winter light. "I have been considering," he said, a rare uncertainty creeping into his usually steady voice, "how best to properly repay the debt I owe your family. I have thought about it a great deal these past months, and I find that no gift, no gesture, no formal repayment feels sufficient to the kindness your father once showed me, nor to the person you have proven yourself to be since." "You have already done far more than was ever required of you," Alara said gently. "Perhaps," Nathaniel said, "but I find I am no longer motivated primarily by what is required. I find myself motivated, instead, by what I want, which is considerably more selfish, and considerably less easy to arrange through a simple financial settlement." Alara's heart quickened, understanding beginning to dawn even before he continued. "I would like to ask you to marry me, Alara," Nathaniel said, turning to face her fully, his usual composure giving way just slightly to something more vulnerable underneath it. "Not out of any remaining debt and not out of obligation to your father's memory, though I honor that memory greatly. I would like to ask you because I have come to admire you more deeply than I have admired anyone in my life, and because I cannot imagine continuing forward without you beside me." For a long moment, Alara simply looked at him, memory rising unbidden of that first terrible evening, walking alone down a dark road in a ragged dress, believing herself forgotten by the world, believing that evening would be remembered, if at all, only as the night she was humiliated in front of the entire county. She thought of how far that memory now stood from the reality unfolding in front of her, in this quiet winter garden, with a man who had risen from his own seat the moment he saw her, and had not stopped choosing her, in one way or another, ever since. "Yes," she said softly, and then more firmly as the word settled fully into certainty, "Yes, Nathaniel, I would like that very much." He took her hands in his relief and happiness plain on his face in a way she had rarely seen him allow himself to show. And for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, content simply to stand together in the cold, bright morning, surrounded by the frost-silvered garden and the quiet, steady promise of everything still ahead of them. Word of the engagement spread through the county with even greater speed than the scandal that had preceded it, though this time the whispers carried nothing but warmth and genuine delight. Lady Cassandra Gray declared herself entirely unsurprised and insisted on personally overseeing several of the wedding preparations. Nora wept happy tears when Alara told her the news and immediately began planning, with great seriousness, exactly which ribbon would best suit the wedding gown. Even Ivy wrote a warm, genuinely joyful letter upon hearing the news, and Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, glad to include her among the small guest list eventually gathered for the ceremony the following spring. The wedding itself took place in the same ballroom where they had first properly met, the ceiling still painted with its soft, eternal sunrise, the tall windows filled now with the bright green light of early summer rather than the cold dark of that first winter evening. Alara wore, this time, a gown of pale ivory silk, carefully chosen and beautifully made, though she found, standing at the top of the same steps she had once climbed alone in rags, that the memory of that earlier night no longer carried any sting at all. It had simply become, in the retelling that would follow her for the rest of her life, the beginning of everything good that came after. 2 years after the wedding, Ashford Manor looked much as it always had, grand and steady against the changing seasons. Though the household within it had grown warmer and busier in ways Alara could not have imagined during those long, lonely years at Winters Hall. She had taken on, gradually, a role she found unexpectedly fulfilling, working alongside Nathaniel to establish a small charitable fund for young women left vulnerable by unscrupulous guardians or unfair inheritance disputes, drawing directly on her own experience to identify cases that might otherwise have gone unnoticed for years. The fund had already helped several families in the county and beyond, quietly correcting injustices similar to the one Alara herself had endured, and she found deep satisfaction in knowing that her own difficult years had, in the end, been transformed into something that eased the path for others facing similar struggles. Nora had married a young groundskeeper from the Ashford estate that same spring, and remained close to Alara as both friend and trusted household manager, the two of them still sharing the easy, honest friendship that had first taken root back when Alara had nothing else in the world to rely on. Lady Cassandra Gray, meanwhile, had become something of a fixture at Ashford Manor, her sharp wit and genuine warmth making her a welcome presence at nearly every gathering, and it was largely through her tireless matchmaking efforts that Ivy Doyle found happiness of her own, marrying a quiet, kind-hearted merchant she had met during one of Cassandra's carefully arranged dinners. Priscilla's path proved slower and more uncertain, though even she, in time, wrote to say she had found steady work managing accounts for a small trading company near the coast, work she admitted, with evident surprise at herself, that she found genuinely satisfying. The two sisters remained cautious with one another, their history too complicated for easy closeness, but the outright cruelty of earlier years had faded into something more like distant, careful civility, and Alara found she no longer carried any bitterness toward either of them. Margaret Doyle lived out her remaining years in quiet obscurity, her name mentioned rarely and without malice, more often simply forgotten by a county that had, in the end, moved on from the scandal that once consumed every dinner conversation for weeks. Alara heard near the end that her former stepmother had grown ill and frail, and though their history made any deep reconciliation impossible, Alara arranged, quietly and without publicity, for a portion of her own household's resources to ensure Margaret was cared for comfortably in her final months. It was not forgiveness, exactly, but it was, Alara felt, the kind of quiet decency her father would have wanted her to extend, even to someone who had wronged her so deeply. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, Alara stood once again in the gardens behind Ashford Manor, now carrying her own small daughter on her hip, watching Nathaniel walk slowly along the same path where he had once asked her to marry him, patiently explaining to their eldest son, barely old enough to understand most of it, the proper names of the flowers blooming along the hedgerows. She thought sometimes of that long, cold walk down the lane from Winters Hall, the ragged dress, the whispered cruelty, the deep, aching loneliness of believing herself forgotten and unwanted by the world around her. It felt now like a memory belonging almost to someone else entirely, distant and softened by everything that had grown up around it since. Her father had once told her, sitting beside the fire in a house that no longer belonged to either of them by the time she needed his words most, that a person's worth was carried inside them, never stitched onto their sleeves. She understood now, watching her husband and children in the golden autumn light, surrounded by a life built carefully out of honesty, kindness, and quiet, stubborn courage, exactly how right he had been. The Duke had risen the moment she walked through his door, dressed in nothing but rags and dignity, and in doing so, he had given the entire county a lesson far more lasting than the one Margaret Doyle had ever intended to teach that night. It was a lesson Alara carried with her still, and one she intended in time to pass down carefully to her own children. That true worth is never measured by the clothes a person wears, but by the strength of character they carry quietly within them, regardless of who is watching, and regardless of what the world decides at any given moment, that person deserves.